Sheree Trotter, welcome to The Good Oil.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I've been following you for a long time, and a lot of your writing, particularly around issues to do with Israel and Zionism. And I thought with everything that's going on in the world since October 7, and since it'd be a good idea to get you on to talk about what motivates you, what drives you, and the things that you're doing. So who is Sheree Trotter for everybody who's going to be watching this?
Wow. The question, who is Sheree Trotter? How far back do I go?
Oh, tell us your whakapapa, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So I'm from Te Arawa, grew up in Rotorua, is my hometown, Sunset Road. One of 6 children, one brother, 4 sisters. Born to a Māori mother, Pākehā father, and so that was my beginning years. Fast forward to married life. I've been married to Sheree Trotter for 39 years, and together we've really been down on this journey with Israel and the Jewish people. I guess the starting point for that comes out of our faith. We are Christians, and that's where the interest first started.
Yeah.
But out of that, we became involved with Israel and the Jewish people in a number of different ways, through hosting Israeli travelers in our country, through traveling to Israel, meeting Holocaust survivors. We ended up photographing and interviewing them and creating exhibitions around that work.
So Perry's a photographer, and what's your training?
My training, well, I'm a researcher, writer. I went back to university to do postgraduate studies after our 4 children had grown up, and I had time on my hands. So I did Zionism in New Zealand at Auckland University in history, completed my PhD there. I guess I would say that's my training. But Perry is a photographer, also a musician. If you see the exhibition, the music that accompanies it is his own music that he's written, piano music. So, we've interviewed 70 survivors over the years. We set up a charitable trust in 2012, and we're still doing that work today. Our last exhibition was recently in Wellsford, so we're still touring this exhibition. So that's one of the projects that we've been involved with over the years.
You studied for a PhD, so I should have used your title really, Dr. Sheree Trotter, but I like to be conversational rather than formal. And what was that on? What was your thesis for that on?
My thesis was Zionism in New Zealand up until 1948.
Up until 1948?
Yes.
Well, that would have been fascinating.
Well, it was a very vibrant period to be studying Zionism, and I framed it within New Zealand so that it was a New Zealand history topic, and part of that was to find a suitable supervisor for the work. Being in New Zealand, we don't necessarily have experts on these areas, so by framing it as a New Zealand history topic, we were able to work that way. And I guess the inspiration for that came from one of the senior members of the Jewish community who told me about the early rabbis in Auckland who were both very Zionist. And one of them was Goldstein, who was the rabbi from 1880 to 1935, 50 years, and then Rabbi Esther, who took over from Goldstein, and he was the rabbi until his retirement in 1970. So it was a very long period where we had these 2 Zionist rabbis. And so that was kind of the initiation to look into this topic and to find out why there was such a vibrant Zionist movement in New Zealand at that time.
What would have the Jewish population been in New Zealand about that time? Because I think it's about 15,000 now.
Yeah, the population's always been very small. I think it's something like 0.01% of the New Zealand population or around about. So I can't tell you the exact number, but it was a very small population over that period.
You're also involved in something called the Indigenous Coalition for Israel. Tell us about that.
So as I was getting more involved with Israel, understanding Israel, I began to see that in New Zealand, we were getting a very one-sided, biased picture of the true story of Israel and what was happening over there politically, geopolitically. And I became involved with fellow Jews and others who were advocating for Israel, trying to bring in a balance, trying to tell the other side of the story. And over that period, I began to see and be concerned about the way Israel was being positioned, the way Māori people actually were being captured by a very anti-Israel narrative. One particular event that sticks out in my mind was when Marama Davidson went to Gaza as an Indigenous woman to stand with the Indigenous woman of Gaza, was the way she framed
Yeah,
it.
that was the flotilla where she got arrested.
Flotilla.
Yeah.
That's right, which was around 2016 or 17. And so I felt very concerned about that. And I began to think about, how do we deal with this where we're just getting this one-sided narrative all the time? Because I knew that there is a body of support for Israel amongst Māori and amongst Indigenous people. And so in order to tap into that and to provide a platform for those voices, I set up the Indigenous Coalition for Israel, invited Honourable Alfred Ngaro to co-direct and be co-lead this with me. And so that was the establishment of that organisation.
And the goals and aims of the organization is just to balance the narrative, so to speak?
Yeah, it's to provide an alternative to tell the story of Maori friendship with and hit the history of Maori Jewish interaction, friendship, to be able to represent those in the Maori community who do stand with Israel, and to educate our people as well.
Yeah, so I know of one iwi, Ngāti Kahungunu, that have been to Israel extensively and have learned the strategies and techniques for language recovery based on Israel's experience in getting people up to speed with learning Hebrew. And so I know within Ngāti Kahungunu that there is a strong support for Israel because it's helping their people to expand their language based on those techniques.
Well, exactly. And the revitalization of Hebrew from the 19th century to today is such a wonderful model for Indigenous peoples in terms of the revitalization of our own languages. And I know that Gilad Zuckerman came here. I think he went to Ngāti Kahungunu as well. And he is an Israeli who's an expert in languages. And he works a lot actually in Australia in helping to revive the Indigenous Australian languages. And so this really is an inspiration for us. And I know from stories I've been told that there have been particular Māori leaders who went to Israel and saw the Ulpan system, which is a full immersion language system that the Israelis use for immigrants who come to Israel and others who want to learn the language. And John Rangiho was this Māori leader who went to Israel and came back and brought that model here, and that was part of the inspiration behind the Kohanga Reo movement.
Just going back a bit, you said that you noticed there was an imbalance in the media. And I've noticed the same thing. Always been a you know, had an interest in history, particularly military history. I collect firearms and antique arms and things like that. I've even got ironically, I've got a machine gun that used to be in the IDF. And before that, it was in the Egyptian army until 1956 when the Israelis captured it in the Sinai. Uh, But the first time I went to Israel was 2014, and I was astonished at what I saw there. That we've got this picture that comes from the media of a society that actually doesn't exist. And when you go and see the vibrant society that lives in Tel Aviv and even in Jerusalem, but Tel Aviv's perhaps more stark. You can go down to Jaffa and go into a cafe there, and you'll be sitting next to an Arab and a Jew and who are else Christians that are there, and there's no animosity. Everyone's just walking the streets, minding their own business everywhere you go in Tel Aviv. Jerusalem's a little bit different because it's kind of segregated by, with East Jerusalem, but it is pretty much the same. And there's a much more conservative view. But what my overriding impression of Israel was that it was like in New Zealand was, say, 40 years ago, in terms of an attitude of, well, how do we solve this problem? I know, well, we'll invent something to do it. This is the Kiwi ethos of number 8 fencing wire, that brought us Fisher and Paykel and Hamilton Jet and Rocket Lab. There's that Kiwi can do attitude. And Israel showed me through the attitude of the people there that they've got the same attitude. Do you think it's a similar would you agree with that there's a similar sort of ethos there? Sadly, we've lost a little bit of that in New Zealand. We had to because of the tyranny of distance. Israel has to because of the tyranny of boycotts. And that was my overriding impression. Is that what you've seen as well?
Well, I agree with you that the way Israel is portrayed here in the media is a complete contrast to the reality of Israeli life. It's a very multicultural society where there's a high degree of coexistence. And I would say, in some ways, more than in New Zealand, actually, a high level of tolerance for other peoples. Notwithstanding that there's always racism in every country, and you'll experience that in Israel as well. Um, but Israel's very diverse, and Israelis themselves are a very open-minded, free-thinking people. And I'm talking about the majority who are more secular Israelis. You can sit down and discuss anything with them and have very vigorous discussions, debates. From a Kiwi perspective, we often think, oh gosh, that sounds a bit heated, because we're not used to those debates.
They're passionate debates, though.
They're passionate, and you can talk about things, and we're all friends at the end of it. It's all as part of their culture to question, to debate, to challenge. And I mean, it's part of their culture. Hundreds of years of rabbis doing this, and so, but they're very open-minded and inquiring sort of people. And as I mentioned to you, we hosted many Israeli travelers. This was in the early 2000s. And we get a lot of young travelers coming here after they've done their army service. And a lot of New Zealanders might not be aware that it is compulsory for young people from 18 to 21 to do army service. So we get many who come here, and, we were just really impressed with these young people who carried such weight on their shoulders of defending their country, something that they're forced to do because they're surrounded by enemies who want to kill them, basically. And they were so mature and so thoughtful. And we just had an amazing time having so many interesting discussions. And I felt, for me, that's when I really started to get to know what Israel was all about and begin to really love the people.
Yeah, I mean, I found that as well myself. What I actually loved about Israel is they're a lot like me, very direct. There's generally no pleasantries or wasting of time when you go somewhere for a meeting or something like that. It's like shake hands, introduce yourselves, sit down, start talking business. And I found that really refreshing, that we didn't have this, you know, what I call pleasantries or idle chit chat. How's the weather? What was the traffic like? There's none of that.
Yeah.
It's let's just talk.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so refreshing that. And somebody else said to me, "Oh, I found Israelis rude," and I said, "No, they're not rude. They're abrupt. This doesn't mean they're rude. They're on a mission for stuff, and they're making things happen, and they don't want to muck around." So I found it. I almost found it liberating. It was like I was at my second home. Yeah.
Yeah, we find that as well, and we feel really comfortable with that because they're very open and direct, and you know what they think. And as you say, they don't have the pleasantries, which is so much part of, I suppose, British culture, is this politeness. And
And
Israelis will often find when they come here, what they realize that what people say is not necessarily what they really think. But you would have heard of the description of the sabra fruit, which is the cactus, which is surrounded by all these prickles, but inside it's a very sweet fruit. And that's the picture of the Israelis, how they describe themselves. They might be prickly on the outside, but very sweet.
Yes, that doesn't. I'm immune to prickliness, right? I'm doing what I do. I'm immune to it, so I don't care. So I loved it. But I found them very open about talking about anything. You could raise any topic. Nothing was taboo. I met a Israeli entertainer. She's famous, but she's so famous I can't remember her name now, but a singer. And we went to this concert, and then afterwards we got to talk to her. And she was openly hostile about the Israeli government in 2014. And in her songs, they're the same. And she was very definitely pro-Palestinian. And I said to her, don't you feel a bit of a hypocrite that you're wanting to topple the Israeli government in favor of a Palestinian government, and yet it's the Israeli government that's allowing you to say these things against their own government? If you tried to do the same in reverse, I doubt you'd be able to say anything hostile about the Palestinian government. And that was 2014, and here we are another, 11 years later. Mahmoud Abbas is into his 22nd year of his 4-year term.
Yeah.
And you've got Israel, a vibrant democracy, where you've got harsh, conservative religious people and utterly liberal, almost woke MPs, plus Arab MPs and everything else in between all of that, all having massive Donnybrooks with each other, but they're all Israelis first.
Well, exactly, and it is a vibrant democracy, and we saw this before the outbreak of 7th of October, that there were huge, massive protests going on the streets of Tel Aviv and elsewhere over, judicial reform and over the government, and it was almost tearing society apart. But
Until they were attacked.
and then they came together, and all the reservists turned up to stand and protect their country.
Do you think that Hamas underestimated or overestimated the division in Israeli society as a result of that vibrant democracy, the differing of opinions, the infighting, the trying to prosecute the prime minister and his wife? They overestimated the level of division that there was in Israeli society and thought, well, let's attack and we'll be able to drive a wedge through them. And then they found that it's their Israelis first.
Yeah, well, possibly, and there are many theories about why they attacked at that point in time, including the possibility of a Saudi deal, with Israel, which was on the horizon, and they wanted to stop that happening. But we do know that the attack was many years in the making, and we know how cynical it was that we had those Gazans going into the homes of those Israelis on the border and befriending them. And some of those people who were the peaceniks in those kibbutz, they were the ones who really believed in this possibility of peace with the Palestinians. They were on the list of people to be murdered, by some of the Hamas and Palestinian people who came in that day. So yeah, it was pretty shocking, really.
It was fairly methodical. The documents that have been discovered show the lists and how people were marked, and they identified people that they wanted to take as hostages. There was targets of opportunity. A good mate of mine who's a psychologist, he spent in the 70s a considerable amount of time living in Be'eri in a kibbutz. And he was absolutely gobsmacked because almost everybody that he knew from back at that time was now dead.
Yeah,
And
shocking.
they lived right there at the border. And he said, I used to drive a tractor and plow the fields and drive up to the fence and then back again. We had people from Gaza that were working in the kibbutz. None of that is occurring anymore.
And that's right. It was some of those Israelis who were driving the people of Gaza to hospitals to help them, who really believed in this possibility of peace. And if they would just do more for them, then they will like us and we will have peace. So, it's a delusion, I think, that has probably been wiped out of the minds of most Israelis by this time. But to have 1,200 people slaughtered in one day,
Simply for being Jewish.
yeah, the highest number of Jewish people killed in one day since the Holocaust is a hugely shocking and traumatic event, which I think the world really hasn't taken a minute to fully absorb. Of course, Israelis have fully absorbed it. They know what it means.
And that's what I've been noticing talking to people in Israel that I know up there, Jewish people here in New Zealand. There's a mindset change that I've detected amongst Israelis and Jewish people. And I don't think Western governments have quite grasped that yet. But because Western governments, and ours included, and Winston Peters, who's a mate of mine, but we are differing on opinions on this one. I said to him, the two-state solution is dead. It's finished. You can't have an agreement between two parties where one party wants everybody of the other party dead. And Golda Meir said that we will have peace when Palestinians value their children as much as Israelis do. And I really believe that the two-state solution cannot exist within the tiny little boundaries of Israel and the West Bank. I think the only way that a two-state solution exists is the original two-state solution, which was Transjordan, which became Jordan, whose flag is the Palestinian flag, but with the star on it. But Jordan doesn't want them. They don't want them there.
Yeah.
They've got this is the thing that astonished me. There's refugee camps in Egypt. There's refugee camps in Lebanon. There's refugee camps in Syria. There's refugee camps in Jordan. And they're as tightly, if not more tightly controlled than Gaza and the West Bank is. And yet everyone blames the Israelis for creating an open-air prison. That's what they use. Those are the slogans they use, despite the five-star hotels that were in Gaza, despite the luxury goods that were there. It's on the Mediterranean, some of the best beaches in the world,
Yes.
and we're told a lie that this is an open-air prison,
Yes.
and it's not.
No, it's not an open-air prison. And people seem to have forgotten that, Israel forcibly removed every Israeli from Gaza.
All their businesses,
2005.
all their staff, all the people.
Exactly. And that was their opportunity to create this beautiful Mediterranean city on the Mediterranean Sea. But what did they do instead? They built a city underground, so that now we have like 500 miles of a tunnel network underground from which they've developed their terrorist base. And so you're right. I mean, there's a border with Egypt. Why doesn't Egypt open its border, let in humanitarian supplies? Why doesn't Egypt take some of the people of Gaza? Because many of them actually came from Egypt in the first place. They are the same people in terms of culture, Arabic culture, Islamic culture. And so, why is the world continuing to pressure only Israel and not the surrounding Arab nations who could solve this problem in a day if they wanted to?
They don't want to, though. They don't want to solve the problem because they want to keep Israel being, fighting insurgents ceaselessly. But
Yeah.
I think that's changing a bit, because my impression is that from the wording, from the statements that were made by Sinwar and others, that when they invaded Israel on October the 7th, they thought that the Palestinian people in the West Bank, that in the refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, would rise up and join this as a new intifada. And I think they actually believed that the Arab nations around Israel would join in as well, and it didn't happen. And I was sitting there watching, and I was thinking, this is either going to get out of hand and turn into the equivalent of the 6-Day War or Yom Kippur even, but it didn't happen. And what we instead saw was a solid 24 hours of mayhem until the IDF got rolling. And when it got rolling, that was it. The others sat back and said, no, we're not going to do anything. And I think that Hamas overestimated the support that they might get from the rest of the Arab world. I mean, sure, they've got their propaganda networks out there in the Western liberal media that are supporting them, but I think they overestimated the support that they would have had for an armed conflict invading a sovereign nation.
Yeah, although we have to bear in mind also there's Hezbollah in the north that started attacking immediately, and of course Houthis, and behind all of these terrorist groups is Iran. So, Israel has been fighting this multi-pronged war and having to deal with a lot of attacks from the West Bank, even though they haven't managed to infiltrate and penetrate into the country. There's still been a lot of attacks from different regions that Israel has had to be dealing with.
Do you think the Abraham Accords helped in that regard, where you had trade deals with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, that Trump had put together these accords that was designed really to neutralize Iran's influence and stop any escalation in the surrounding countries around Israel? Do you think that those Abraham Accords helped slow that down, that possible support that Hamas might have got?
I think they were highly significant. Probably the most significant achievement there's been in the Middle East, over the period of Israel's life. And it'll be interesting to see what happens now. I mean, I've been watching with curiosity to see Trump going through these Arab nations making trillion-dollar deals. I'm not sure what it all means at this stage, but it's very interesting to watch.
I just want to touch again on my visit to Israel, and I went to some of those kibbutzes that are close to the Gaza border. I was in Sderot visiting the police station. The police station was burnt to the ground in that invasion, which had a museum there of all of the items that Hamas uses to make rockets and things like that. I've been in those places, like literally. I was in the bomb shelter across the road from that police station when rockets were coming at me. You know, I had to take shelter several times when I was in Israel in 2014, and I saw this indefatigable attitude of the Israelis that they were going to be safe, that the IDF had provided safety for them and their families. Yes, of course, their houses had strong rooms and safe rooms, and that's what saved a lot of people on October 7. But it brought home to me just how close the danger was. I think New Zealanders don't actually understand, how small Israel is. It fits in the distance between, from north to south of Wellsford to Hamilton,
Mhm.
and maybe comes up short on that, and it's even narrower than that. That's from the top, and I saw that when I drove from Haifa down to Gaza. Only a couple of hours in a
Yeah.
car.
Very
Yeah.
tiny, and yet it's the most contested piece of real estate in the entire world, I would say. Look, I've been there twice since the 7th of October on 2 different delegations, and been down to the Nova site, been into some of those bomb shelters, been to Sderot. And you're right, it's just, over the fence, literally, that. And I guess the difference with the 7th of October was that penetration into Israel. Previously, they had been protected by their bomb shelters. When the bombs came, they could run to their shelter and be safe. And many of them ran to their shelters, but they didn't have locks on the door because their shelters weren't set up to protect them from invaders coming into their
No, they're set up
homes
to protect you from
from
rockets
bombs.
and bombs.
That's right. And so many of them were caught short by that and, murdered in their homes, literally murdered, raped, kidnapped, and it was horrendous, the scale of brutality, barbarity of that day, and the fact that they celebrated it. And, there's that image of the one young Palestinian who phoned mum and said, "Mum, I've killed 10 Jews today." Uh, Sadly, this is what they're indoctrinated into with their school system in New
With
Zealand.
fun.
funds it through UNRWA, $1 million a year. And you look at those materials, and there are many studies been done that show they are anti-Semitic. They inculcate Jew hatred, encourage and indoctrinate children towards martyrdom. And there is no hope if that is the culture that they're being brought up into. And
You
7th
can't have
October,
peace with that, can you?
no, you can't. And 7th of October was a demonstration of what that culture produces.
When I was there, I was attacked by the New Zealand media for being there. It was when there was Hamas was rocketing Israel in 2014. It was a short period of time. I got to see the Iron Dome in action. It's a pretty amazing system. But I was accused of being biased. They said, well, why aren't you going to Gaza? Well, there's 2,000 journalists in Gaza, and they're reporting there wearing their helmets and their flak jackets. And I was in Sderot on that little hill that overlooks, it's only 800 yards from the border. And there was Mike McRoberts, a couple of 100 meters away, standing there with a helmet on and a flak jacket. And the group I was with, some of them were journalists from Taiwan and places like that. And I said, see that guy over there? He's a Kiwi journalist. I said, well, you're a Kiwi journalist. Where's your helmet and flak jacket? And I said, well, we don't need one, do we? The guy from the tour company is standing here with us. Everyone else is standing here with us. It's for show.
Mm.
It's for show.
Yeah.
Now, it's pretty frightening when those rockets go off over the top of your head and get intercepted and the bits of metal come flying down. People don't understand that. But I said to the journalists that were accusing me, one was Lisa Owen, who's now at Radio New Zealand, a couple of others, and they accused me of being biased. I said, no, I am the balance.
Yeah.
I am the balance. You've got everybody else reporting from the Palestinian point of view, and I'm here having a look and seeing things from the Israeli point of view. I am the balance.
It's a curious thing, that you can study a topic for years, as I've done at PhD level about, Jewish history, Zionism, Israel. Because I've done that study, that type of thinking, those type of people seem to think that because you've studied it, you're biased, rather than thinking because you've studied it, you may know something about it. Perhaps you should be seen as an expert on the topic as opposed to being seen as biased. And it's the same with going to Israel. People who've gone to Israel, they see what it's like on the ground, and they see that actually what we're hearing here is nothing like the reality. That's not bias. That's actually having some information, having some knowledge about a place.
Oh, absolutely. Journalists of all people should know that you need to check both sides of the story, not grind an axe. Our media here seems to grind an axe. Our politicians here largely are either silent, and I view that as cowardice, or are very vehemently in support of the actions of Hamas. I just can't understand how we can accept the Green Party organising all of these protests every weekend, actually making genocidal, comments and statements, including from Chloe Swarbrick when they're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That means the genocide of every Jew between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, and they get away with it.
And most of their followers have no idea which river or which sea. That's the level of ignorance. They're just parroting these lies with having no understanding of the situation at all.
Or accepting, casualty figures. 30,000 have been killed, and they say, oh, this is terrible, they're all Palestinians. Well, 18,000 of those are Hamas fighters.
Exactly.
But-
And our news will report, night after night, these casualty figures without actually understanding that they come from Hamas. There's no freedom of press in Gaza. The only information that comes out is what Hamas allows to come out. And so they will quote those figures as if they're authoritative when it's actually propaganda.
Queers for Palestine is the one that always cracks me up.
Mm. Yeah, they really need to go there and find out what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Tel Aviv, and we went out for dinner at that restaurant, and I think it's the Hilton Hotel right on the waterfront. It's got a rooftop restaurant, open air. And while we were sitting there, the sirens went off And in Tel Aviv, you've got a fair bit of time and everyone, all the people who were like me, who were tourists or there, all leapt up and ran for the shelters. But I looked around and there was a fair few people, locals clearly, they didn't even move.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I thought
Get used to it.
that's when I realized it wasn't about getting used to it, is that they trusted the IDF to defend them, that they had systems in place, which meant they could happily continue their meal in the open air restaurant. The waiters and the staff, the chefs, none of them went. Everybody just carried on. And that's when I made this realization that I'm actually okay here.
Yeah.
It's not as dangerous as people have made out. But, if you are going to visit Israel, the best time to visit Israel is when there's shooting on, because there's no tourists.
Well, yes, although I must say that going post 7th of October was a very different experience to previously, whereas previously you could go and there was kind of an uplifting spirit in the air. It was a very different experience post 7th of October. And, I feel sad for the Palestinians that their leaders don't care enough about them to have bomb shelters, or actually just to have an attitude of wanting to make peace. And, coming back to what we said about the way things are narrated in the West, we in the West had this idea that they think the same way that we
Oh,
thought.
they don't.
But you look at Hamas, it's in their charter that they will want to annihilate, the Jewish state. And so there's some of these kind of fundamental underlying things that are so significantly different. And I think the West fails to really comprehend that. But I think it would be wonderful if, the Palestinians had bomb shelters instead of having tunnels for Hamas to carry on their attacks on Israel.
It is astonishing that how ignorant Kiwis largely are about geopolitics in that area. That, they talk about Lebanon and these terrible things that happen in Lebanon without realizing that Hezbollah pretty much controls the Lebanese government. Large swathes of southern Lebanon up to the Litani River are Hezbollah controlled villages, all backed by Iran. Even parts of Western Syria are controlled by Hezbollah. And then you look at the West Bank, which is controlled largely by Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, which executed all the Fatah people in Gaza and won the election, then set about executing everybody that opposed them. None of these countries are democratic, and Israel is democratic, surrounded by those. And Israel desperately wants to have peace, because who wants constant war? It's very expensive, constant war. And Kiwis don't seem to understand this, that when Israel retaliates, it's after significant provocation that they retaliate.
Right. Yeah.
I think the only time where they've preempted anything was in the 6-Day War, where they went and got the Egyptian and Jordanian Air Force on the ground and then mounted a very rapid assault. But most of the wars that Israel has fought have been defensive in nature after significant provocation. But we're told that that Israel, invaded Gaza. Well, hang on a second. What happened on October 7th? It's like we've forgotten that.
Exactly. And, the media, the West is so myopic as well. I mean, if you zoom out a little bit and see what's happened in Syria just recently, there's been a slaughter of Alawite Christians in Syria with this new
You wouldn't
leader.
know that from the media.
You wouldn't know it, but that's horrendous. And one of my roles is the director of the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem. And I've had a message through our website from a man who's saying, I've got a Syrian Christian woman friend in Syria. Can you help me get her out of there? Her neighbors have all been murdered. I mean, what can I do? I can't do much. But the media is ignoring some of these huge things that are happening just next door to Israel. There's this myopic focus on this one situation, and it's bizarre, really.
It's like when you go to the Golan Heights and you're on top of Mount Bental looking over into Syria. Everything up into the fence on the Israeli side is all green, lush fields. They've got farmers working in the fields. Across the fence, it's dirt. You can look at Al Qanetra and then some of the villages that are north that are Druze villages, where Druze are being persecuted by the Syrian regime, both Assad and the new one that's taken over. There's really no different. They've just sort of swapped uniforms almost. And Israel, went into northern Syria off the Golan Heights to protect those Druze villages, and most of those Druze are happily now going backwards and forwards into Israel. And nobody reports on that.
No.
That the Druze were being persecuted both by Assad and by they call them the Free Syrian, but they're actually, a lot of them are Al Qaeda terrorists that changed uniforms. The guy who's the leader of Syria now, who France has just been, celebrating. They said they won't accept Netanyahu to come to France, but they accept an Al Qaeda terrorist to come to France.
Yeah, Al-Jalani.
Yeah.
Shocking.
I mean, the French have always been known for their ability to march backwards, though, haven't they?
Although I see Trump has met with him also. So, it's a lot of puzzling things going over there at the moment.
Well, the thing with what's happened in Syria and people haven't really looked at yet is the Russians abandoned all their bases.
True.
Right? So their port, that they had paid for, that the Syrians had developed, paid for, but completely gone. There's no Russian ships there. There's no Russian submarines parked up there. The Russian air bases that are nearby there, all abandoned. There's been a significant change in Syria with the Russians that were propping up Assad, and now they're gone. And so I can understand why Trump is talking to them, and he'll be, again, doing his normal thing. He'll have a bat in one hand and a bag of cash in the other and saying to them, well, you can have the bat or you can have the cash. I'm pretty sure they'll take the cash, and then we'll see a US base in there, which will enable rapid escalation if anybody decides they're going to play up.
Interesting to see how it plays out, for sure.
It will be. I mean, it'd be quite easy to move in and take over those bases. And then you've got a Mediterranean port on the eastern seaboard side of the Mediterranean that's close to Turkey. That's close to, only an hour's flight across Israel to Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Be a pretty powerful air base sitting there. Your PhD was on Zionism. That gets hurled around a lot, that word.
Yeah.
As an insult. Usually I've been called a Zionist, and I'm shrugged and went, so what? What does Zionism mean to you?
To me, well, Zionism is really the movement towards the establishment of a Jewish state. So it was a nationalist movement. It's the movement of self-determination of the Jewish people in their homeland. But you're right, it gets a bad press, but it has an ancient heritage. The word Zion, comes from a hill in Jerusalem, which is called Mount Zion.
Yep.
And of course, for the Jewish people, it has a lot of spiritual significance. And this is their indigenous heartland. Jerusalem is it's where their culture sprang forth from over 3,500 years. Mount Zion is where the city of David was, which is still there today. So there's these very ancient kind of connections to what Zion is. The word Zion itself has been used interchangeably with Israel, with Jerusalem. So there's a lot of meaning tied up in that word Zion. So the Zionist movement, which began in the 19th century, kicked off by Theodor Herzl, although there were a lot of antecedents to him, of course, but he started the Zionist Congress and congresses and is seen as the one who initiated the movement. That was a very secular movement. Herzl himself was secular. He wasn't religious. He was a European, and it really came out of a realization that the problem of the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe was not going to go away. I mean, Herzl tried lots of different ways to try and find acceptance in Europe, in Austria and France. But there was the Dreyfus trial in France, and Herzl was a reporter at that trial. And he realized that anti-Semitism was such a huge problem that the only answer for the Jewish people was to have their own homeland. And so he wrote his manifesto for a Jewish homeland, and that kick-started a movement. But having said that, like I said, it had started earlier. There were Jewish people returning to the land prior to Herzl. And so essentially that's what Zionism is. It's support for a Jewish state, and that was the name of that movement.
Yeah, it gets hurled around, as I said before, it gets hurled around as an insult. What it means to me is simply that you believe in the right of Israel to exist as a country, that a place where Jews can feel safe, where they're protected. And, I would have thought we had learned from World War II, that we'd learned from the Holocaust, that anti-Semitism in all of its forms is awful. That was a pogrom that was industrialized. There's been pogroms all around the world. The funny thing is that a lot of the royalty, like the Habsburgs and people like that, got their power funded by Jewish bankers and then promptly killed them, in the 1500s and in the 1600s with, they had large loans and they couldn't sustain themselves. Well, we'll fix that loan the easy way. We'll kill the guy that has it. And you had all of these Jewish communities that were driven out of small towns in Europe and places like that. And so, after literally thousands of years of persecution of Jews simply for being Jewish, and by a large number of Christians, actually, that anti-Semitism is just as bad, if not worse now, than it was back in World War II, where people think it's okay to graffiti things on the street in Wellington that I hated Jews before it was cool. That's an awful thing to put on the wall. Now, being a free speech sort of absolutist myself, people can have hateful thoughts and say hateful things, but we're allowed to oppose that as well. But there's this almost silencing of anybody who supports Israel. They're driven out of the media, their voices aren't heard, and we've got a whole bunch of far left people that wearing terrorist tea towels, who are almost identical to the far right skinhead morons who like dressing up in black shirts and parading around like a bunch of puffs. And they're almost identical in their beliefs. And I've seen in the political left, especially, rather than the conservative right, that anti-Semitism is rife right through the left wing. You scratch a socialist, you'll find an anti-Semite. Has that been your experience? Have you seen things like that?
For sure. And I guess this is the thing with anti-Semitism. It has this shape-shifting nature to it. And, many people have described this, that when under the hundreds of years of Christianity being the dominant force in society, Jews were hated because of their religion. And then under Nazi Germany, when scientific racism was the theory of the day, Jews were hated because of their race. And today we live in this age of where settler colonialism is, the greatest evil. And so now Jews have a state, and so the way the narrative is framed is that Jews shouldn't have a state, and Jews are now hated.
And they should go back to Europe or wherever they came
from. Which is just, bizarre, since most of them come from Arab lands. But so now Jews are hated because they have a state. And this is kind of the insidious and weird dynamic that there is with anti-Semitism, that it shifts and it changes according to the currents of the day.
So let's talk about that settler colonialism, because you've written a couple of articles. They're worth a read. I'll put links to those in under the video when we publish this, because I think it explains a lot about what we're seeing in New Zealand being driven by Te Pāti Māori in particular. But we're also seeing it in the anti-Semitism that's being driven against Israel and the right of a Jewish state to exist. So tell us a bit more about your thoughts on the settler colonialism.
Hmm. Well, settler colonialism is a particular kind of post-colonial ideology, started to develop in the 1990s with people like Patrick Wolfe, Veracini, and others. And you're right, it's become quite a dominant narrative in New Zealand currently. What it is the idea that there are imperial powers that have set out to colonize distant lands and to settle in those lands and to send their people over to settle those lands and to kind of replicate their own society in those lands.
Yeah.
And so we can understand and see how that has worked with Britain to New Zealand, the settling of Australia, of Canada, of America. And these are all framed as settler colonial nations. And we can see that and we can agree with that. But the thing with the settler colonial model is that it overlays a political and ideological lens over history. And so history becomes interpreted in a particular way. And at the core of this interpretation is this idea of power relationships that need to be interrogated. And so it creates this scenario where society is made up of all these structures that are designed to oppress the powerless. And one of the key quotes from Patrick Wolfe is that settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. And so therefore what these ideologues are trying to do is that they're interrogating all these structures of our society, of Western society, that's how they describe it, and they are trying to dismantle those structures. And so we can think of all of the structures of our society, including the government, academia, church. All of these things need to be interrogated and dismantled according to the ideology.
But it's a lens to a certain time that I see the discussions around settler colonialism. And it's about the British, mainly the British in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. But even when you say 17th, 18th, 19th century, what happened to first, second, third, fourth, everything up to the 17th century? Because if you look at what Rome did, they were still expanding, their empire for several hundred years until they started waning again. But when the Roman Empire collapsed in on itself and ceased to exist as a power, the groups that were colonized didn't exist anymore because through 300 years, 400 years, in some places in Italy, for example, in the north and the south that were close to Rome, the Etruscans, for example, didn't exist anymore. In Britain, none of the British tribes that were subjugated by the Romans existed anymore. And then you had some new history created when the Angles, the Saxons, the Dukes, and then later the Norse, and the Norse also conquered Normandy and parts of France, and then ultimately ended up coming back through into the UK. It's like we ignore all of that, which was technically settler colonialism, but we're focusing on this modern construct that this is bad. It's bad in New Zealand, that Maori are hard done by, and it's particularly bad in Israel, where Israel has come. People who live in Israel came from Europe. They need to go back to Europe, and so the anti-Semitism or that anti-imperialism that existed for a very short amount of time, that no longer exists today, except the United States gets accused of it. That's all gone. We're looking at this lens of a very short amount of time. And if you look at the history of the earth, it's a very short amount of time that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, this is what the ideology of settler colonialism does. It tries to, it argues that it's an ongoing colonisation is ongoing, and it does have a focus on the current nations where there are Indigenous peoples who've been colonised, so hence the emphasis on places like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America.
Yeah, so but
And
there's
of
no
course Israel.
there's no Indigenous populations in France. There's no Indigenous populations in
Yes,
in the
yes,
UK.
but I'm talking about settler colonialism, which has developed as an ideology in the 1990s to understand what is
Yeah.
happening currently today. So it's kind of specific in its kind of purview, if you want to say it that way.
But history
Um,
defeats it, doesn't it?
well, it yeah, if you're a historian and you know what's happened in the past, but this this is, although having said that, I have seen that they've started to go back in history and analyse what has happened historically. But in terms of the ideology and way it's playing out, it's very political and what it's trying to do today. And when applied to Israel, of course, it just doesn't fit because Israel didn't have a metropole, the metropole being the imperial power that sets out to establish its people in another land. The Jewish people come back, were not part of a metropole. They were largely pushed out of their lands because of persecution, pushed out of Eastern Europe and Russia, and then, of course, after the Holocaust, pushed out of Europe. And so Israel does not fit the model of being settler colonial nation, but this ideology insists that Israel is the archetypal settler colonial nation. So again, it's a political lens that doesn't work historically. It doesn't work historically, but it's not history, it's politics.
Mm.
That's what it is. But our country is very much caught up in that at the moment, which really concerns me because it's divisive. You know, it doesn't offer hope for people, and it plays on or builds and cultivates a sense of grievance without giving um, answers that will work for everybody in this country. And I love this nation. You know, I'm Māori, I'm Pākehā. I love my Māori people. I love my Pākehā people. I love New Zealand. Whereas settler colonialism seeks to divide us into different camps. And I think this is what we're seeing currently, and it's very sad.
The natural conclusion to if settler colonialism is bad, which we're told it is, right? And the answer to that is, well, we need to decolonize. That's really rather dangerous.
Yeah, we have no
idea.
idea what that actually is, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, many of these proponents paint an idealistic picture of the past. But from a Māori perspective, so I'll put on my Māori hat now, you know, our people always embraced innovation and we embraced new things. So, you know, with colonization came modernity, came Christianity, came literacy, and many of our people embraced these
Laws.
different things. So, yes, what do they mean by decolonizing, and what is our current system going to be replaced with? And, you know, I think that that's dangerous.
Well, I mean, I'm always reminded of the Monty Python skit from The Life of Brian, set obviously in Israel, and they're sitting there saying, "Well, what have the Romans ever done for us?" And then someone says, "Well,
Bridges.
there's the roads." You know, oh well, apart from the roads, what have the Romans ever done for us? Sanitation. Oh well, apart from that, it goes on and on like that, and that's what I feel like we're entering that same farcical debate that was satire from 35 years ago from Monty Python. That's as accurate today as it was back then, and we're entering into this farcical debate about what decolonization looks like, and it doesn't end well in any way that any permutation that you look at. For New Zealand, it seems that it's a return to tribalism.
I think we need a new way of having the conversation that is constructive, that looks at what is what is good and what is best in each of our perspectives and cultures, that allows room for and honors people in their culture and the things that they want to retain and keep hold of. And for me personally, as a Māori, I'm really sad that I was deprived of language, Māori language. I was not able to grow up hearing my mum speak to
And
me.
you grew up in Rotorua too.
Grew up in
Very
Rotorua,
strong.
but and I'll reveal my age. At that time, we didn't have the resurgence that we have today. Um, I had a conversation recently with an elderly Pākehā woman, and she said to me, I remember when my schoolmates were being punished for speaking their language, and she said it broke my heart. I thought it was so unjust, and what it did was it silenced them. They just didn't speak. And, when I think about my Māori mum, I never heard her speak the language. And I think that's part of what happens when you silence people that way. It creates shame because you're actually attacking what's at the very core of the essence of a person's being is their language. So for me personally, I feel I've been deprived of being able to grow up and hear the language spoken around me. And, language is one of those things that is at the core of a culture, and I think it should be honoured. But I think in terms of the way forward, we need to have more positive conversations, seeing the good in each other's culture rather than this battle that's going on and, the criminalizing of people or the silencing of people who think differently to how we think. But, there's a phrase about talking past each other,
Yes.
and that's what happens a lot. We're not actually taking the time to sit and listen and understand the other.
Well, I think that comes from politicians because I've talked about this a lot when I was coming in on the ferry the other day and I was sitting next to Mike Lee and having a chat with him. We ended up with about 10 people up on their chairs, all looking around, watching the two of us talking. Now, Mike Lee has been a left wing politician for a long, long time, and I've been and still am a conservative liberal, right? I'm very liberal on social issues and very conservative on fiscal issues. Um, I'm quite happy for people to live how they want as long as it doesn't impinge on me. Whereas socialists and communists tend to want to impinge on the rights of you as an individual to have this collective nirvana, which has never been able to be delivered anywhere in the world. Anyway, Mike Lee and I were talking and we were agreeing on like 90% of stuff, and people couldn't believe that we weren't getting angry with each other. And then at the end of it, we kind of like had a couple of people come up and say, wow, that's the most amazing discussion we've had. And that's what I've tried to do, since remaking myself, I guess, after I had a very severe stroke, that I didn't want to be confrontational anymore in politics, that divisiveness, that polarization that Helen Clark personifies still to this day, that was perpetuated again when she was finally replaced by John Key. This cult of personality where you have to believe 100% in what your team says and does. There's the reason why I'm so friendly with Chris Trotter and people like that. They're on the left. We don't agree on, and I've put it down to this: we don't agree on how we deliver a solution, but we both agree the outcome is what we want. And you're right. We do need to be having conversations. That's why these podcasts are not confrontational. I've been accused by the media of asking soft questions, but the topics we're discussing are very, very tough. We've discussed Gaza, we've discussed Palestinian rights, we've discussed Zionism. Many people are afraid to have those discussions. I think we need to have those more often and not shy away from it because people are putting a label on us as one thing or another.
Well, I think there's a reason why podcasting has become so popular. And, I was put onto podcasting, listening to them a couple of years ago by my young adult children who I learned to listen to podcasts that are a couple of hours long. And, we have this perception of the 30-minute soundbite.
15 minutes or 5 minutes out.
Exactly. But actually, that shows that a lot of people, young people, actually want to hear people just having conversation and thrashing out these issues without the gotcha mentality, which is what media does.
Yeah, the media's trying to set you up to get you, and then when they get you, they then hound you so that you can apologize, and then they get you for apologizing, saying, "Well, didn't you believe that in the first place?" Oh, we see this all the time.
Yeah.
Winston Peters was attacked the other day because he's changed his mind on something, and they said, "But hang on, you said this 10 years ago." Well, are you not allowed to change your mind? Once you've reached a position on something, do you have to always hold to that?
Yeah. And it seems
It's
to be
rubbish.
that they're just either they've already made up their minds. This is mainstream media. They've already made up their minds what they think, and then they try and manipulate, an interview to kind of reinforce their own view, or they're looking for clickbait. It's sort of they're not giving. I mean, I remember the days where you had actual kind of debates on TV where you could hear both sides of a story, and gone are those days.
Well, public meetings used to be like that. I mean, I was brought up in a political household. I've been to hundreds of meetings in Eden electorate and wider than that. And there used to be these robust political debates. Yes, there was heckling and things like that, but it got worse and worse and worse. And it certainly ramped up in the 90s, until eventually in 1999, Helen Clark took over. And we had this attitude that we've got to shout the others down. Muldoon never wanted to shout the others down. He welcomed having some boisterous opposition, whether it was in his party or outside of his party. He welcomed that robust because he believed in his own ability to be able to debate the points and win the cogent argument. We've seemed to have lost that.
Mm.
You watch Parliament today, and it's performative. They're all so there's the Green Party all sitting there in their terrorist tea towels. For what? I mean, women don't wear keffiyeh anyway. This is the joke of it. Palestinians don't wear keffiyeh. The only person who did was Yasser Arafat, a terrorist. He started to wear that, to wear the keffiyeh. In the Arabian Peninsula, it's worn routinely by men,
Right.
and it's not a shawl that you can tie a knot in and wear it. And it just cracks me up.
Yeah.
That it's all for the cameras. If the cameras weren't there, they wouldn't do it.
Yeah, it's the performativity, also a lot of emoting as well, and not a lot of rational argument.
Yeah, and it's all about feels, not facts. Well, facts don't care about feelings because they're facts. They stand on their own. And take Israel, there is undeniable historical proof being dug up to this day, almost anywhere in Israel, of the historical connection to the land, tangata whenua, in a Maori sense, of Jews living in that land for thousands of years. You see on X, which is hilarious, you see these people say, "Oh, Jesus was a Muslim." Islam didn't start rocking up for another 600 years. Okay, so he couldn't have been. But that's the sort of low information stuff that gets spread around that is basically latent anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So if we undo settler colonialism, that will win in violence, I think. I'm worried about New Zealand and this rhetoric that's going on, that we can't have a debate in it for a bill in Parliament without people pointing their fingers like a gun at the opposing teams, shouting down the opposing teams, not wanting to have the debate. It's a tragedy because we used to welcome debates.
Yeah, I think it's a worry at the moment, where we're at and where we're heading, and it'll take some cool, wise heads, I think, to lead us forward.
You've written about the Indigenous case for Israel.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I think you've kind of summed it up, actually. It's this. Well, firstly, there's been this false narrative about Jews being foreign colonizers, foreign white colonizers who've come and dispossessed the indigenous Palestinians. And that whole narrative is false, because Jews have been in the land for more than 3,500 years. There's been a continuous presence in the land. And when we say they're indigenous to the land of Israel, Judea, Samaria, that is the land within which their peoplehood developed, their unique culture, their practices, their religion, their language, all developed within that land. And that's what makes them indigenous to that land. And aside from having that continuous presence, even when they were expelled from the land, they always kept connected to that land and their practices. Jews pray 3 times a day facing towards Jerusalem, wherever they are in the world. The Jerusalem, Israel, the plants of the land is embedded in all of their festivals and their prayers. And so this deep connection they have kept with the land for centuries. And that is the mark of an Indigenous people.
It's funny too, because I love words. I love finding out where they came from. Palestinian. They're actually Arabs. Palestinian, or the word Palestine, ironically, is a word that was invented by the Romans, who were colonizing Israel at that time, and decided they really didn't like these uppity Jews that kept fighting them. So we're going to rename this land here and we're going to call it Palestina. And it was designed as an insult.
Exactly, yeah.
It was a Latinization of the word Philistines. Now, Ezekiel 25 talks about what happens to Philistina in very brutal terms, because they went against the word of God. And Gaza is described as the remnant from the sea in that piece. I don't know if you've read Ezekiel 25, but you should. It's very, very interesting on what it says. And if you read that in the context of today, you realize that they haven't got a chance of winning this, because the people of the book, the actual book, will win. And they're not people of the book. They are violent criminals and terrorists. And they will be defeated according to the Bible.
Yeah, well, you're right. The Romans came and renamed Judea,
Yeah.
Syria, Palestina, after their ancient enemies. And of course, Judea is where the word Jew comes from, which just re-emphasizes or enforces what I've just said about that connection to the land. There's that deep connection to the land. And this is the area which is, today in East Jerusalem, which is in the so-called Palestinian territories, and which is hotly contested, and which New Zealand has decided every Jew needs to withdraw from these territories. So we're asking Jews to withdraw from their indigenous heartland of Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And they took it apart rock by rock till there was nothing left. And it wasn't until the Muslim expansion to remove the Crusader states that were in place that a mosque was built, supposedly in place of that. But it's kind of funny, because there's remnants that are left, even though the Romans cleared the entire surface of the Dome of the Rock. They left clues behind as to where the temple was. And where the mosque is not where the temple was. It's really interesting when you look into that.
Yeah.
But people forget that. Like they talk about the settler colonialism, right? We've touched on that a lot. Now we're talking about the actual indigenous people of the area being Jews.
Yeah.
And they forget the various caliphates, from Egypt, or from the east, or even the Turks, and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which invaded Europe and went almost to the gates of Vienna. The fall of Constantinople, the rise of Mehmet, and what he achieved, being able to take what was called the Big Apple. People forget about Islamic empires that took over these areas and wiped people out because they didn't fit. And that's why when I was talking about that history, I was saying, but hang on, there's things that happened before this lens that we're looking at of settler colonization. The Ottoman Empire, started in the 1400s, 1300s, and it lasted all the way to 1918, and then it was disbanded. That's a long time of settler colonization by the Ottoman Empire.
And you can tell, which is the colonizing force by the dominance of language. So which is the dominant language across the Middle East? It's Arabic.
It's Arabic.
Which is the dominant language across the West? It's English.
It's English.
So languages like Hebrew, like Māori, these are the indigenous languages that have been endangered, have been through their periods of being endangered and being revitalized. And so that's just another kind of indication of which is the colonizing force.
Well, and that's a perfect example of that you can't argue about that.
That's right.
The Hebrew was pretty much wiped out. There was very few Hebrew speakers. It's now the language of a country. The army uses Hebrew. They also use English, of course, but that's the thing I found in Israel is almost everybody speaks English. Right? Sometimes they don't let on that they speak English, and that's to their advantage. But pretty much everybody that I met in the IDF and all that all spoke English. They only chose or were told to only speak Hebrew so that it would slow down any questioning and information and intelligence that might be spread by that.
And Israel is more advanced than us in that way because you'll know that, the road signs are all in at least Hebrew and Arabic. And yet we have a big kind of hoo-ha here about having some signs in Māori, which is the indigenous language of this country. A lot of foreigners who come here are very surprised that not many people know how to speak Māori. So, that's the flip side of that.
Well, it's interesting you talk about road signs. You're right, there is a big hoo-ha. Or there's a big hoo-ha about renaming Hamilton with some made-up name or Auckland with some name that it could be different. There was many different iwi in Auckland. You even had the invasion from Ngāpuhi into Auckland. So what do we use? Do we use the Ngāpuhi word for Auckland? Do we use the Ngāti Awa word for Auckland?
I think Tamaki Makaurau is the word, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's Auckland. Which part? Is that the North Shore? Because that's not Auckland, but it is now. Things change. But by and large, most of the place names in New Zealand are Maori.
Yeah, many of them.
And no one cares. So, we touched on that earlier about, that people are feeling under pressure by this decolonization, this, forcing it. Maori nearly died out as a language, and yet we've got now government departments, local bodies that are kind of forcing the use of Maori on people rather than there being a free choice there. And that doesn't work either. When you have all of these government departments with names that people don't recognize, they don't understand. The vast majority of New Zealanders speak English. It's okay to have Maori names for them, but is that the primary reason for them? Does everyone know what Kaingaora means?
Makes sense to have both names.
Makes sense to have both, but where do you end? We're a multicultural society. In parts of South Auckland, Samoan is the predominant language. In other parts of South Auckland, Tongan is. In parts of the North Shore, Afrikaans is the predominant language. I was born in Fiji. My willingness to learn Maori is far below my willingness to learn Fijian.
But you can go to Fiji and hear Fijian, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
But you can also hear Hindi. You can also hear English. You can hear all of those.
I think that's part of the conversation that these conversations need to be had about. I don't know if there'll be an answer. What kind of country are we? Are we a bicultural nation started with a treaty between two parties? Are we a multicultural nation? Do we have a particular culture that those immigrants coming into New Zealand should learn and be part of, or are we going to be continually shifting and changing and adapting to new cultures that come in? I mean, they're really difficult questions to
They are
have.
difficult. But I don't think we want to be a monoculture either.
Well, we're not.
We're not, right? I don't
Though we have been.
I don't think we're bicultural either. You know, we've had in the last 10, 20 years mass immigration. Immigration, you know, prior to the 80s really was largely from the UK or from English-speaking countries of a similar mind to us. Since the 80s, we've had a lot of Pacific Island migration come to New Zealand. We've had people from other countries in other areas that are coming to New Zealand, particularly India, uh, you know, the subcontinent, you know, and all around there. Now we've got a large, you know, importation of people from Islamic nations that are changing the dynamics of New Zealand. In Auckland, we can see this in places like Mount Roskill, right, where there's halal shops in gay abandon all over the place. That's fine. I don't care. I'm not going to buy anything from there. If they want to provide halal shops, that's fine. But it does change our society, and we're not consulted as individuals or even as groups where this is just what's happened. Politicians have led this globalist type thing that all immigration is good immigration, and I disagree with that because I don't think all immigration is good immigration.
I guess we have our say through voting in the parties that best represent our position.
Well, we can do that. And, you know, case in point is the ACT Party or New Zealand First or the Greens, right? They're small parties. And if the National Party and the Labour Party don't agree on these sorts of things, the small parties kind of can't either because they're so small, they don't have enough power to do it. And so MMP has not ushered in a government of enlightenment that we were sold it as. It's ushered in a stagnant government where the two big parties dominate and the minor parties to get to fight over the periphery or around the outside of particular issues, which means we don't deal with the big issues.
Although you can see that with the coalition agreement, some of those minor parties have had quite a big
This time round,
impact.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is the first time that we've actually seen it, and I think that's because the National Party was diminished in size from under the, you know, John Key had a 40% plus party and the minor parties were 1% and 2% or 3% there. With the diminishment of those larger parties down into the high 20s or the low 30s, that's given room for the Green Party and ACT and New Zealand First to grow and then to stamp a more impactful form of government that is addressing those things. And of course, we're seeing the issues that arise around that too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. But just coming back for a minute to our identity, I think, you know, what is unique about our country is Māori culture. That's what sets our country apart from other countries. And I think there's got to be a place for honouring the way this country started out with the two peoples that came together.
I think most people agree with you on that.
Yeah.
But what we've got is a whole bunch of rowdies that are dealing with the extremes and ignoring what the majority of New Zealanders think.
I think it's been a bit of a problem that the discussion has been driven by extremists at both ends, extreme positions at both ends, rather than being kind of an organically grown conversation. It's been very politicized. And when you've got ACT at one end pushing something that's diametrically opposed to Māori Party at the other end, it's not really helpful for the country in a constructive way forward.
See, with the ACT Party, you can try and discuss it with them, right? You can say, hang on a second, guys. I understand your classical liberal position here that we're all inherently equal and we've got this and that, but we've got a shared history here that we need to deal with, that we need to resolve. That's why we've had treaty settlement processes in place. And what you're saying is something different to that. But you haven't adequately expanded on that, or the alternative is the media haven't let you adequately expand that, but you knew that anyway, that they're hostile to you, so you have to find ways to put that around, and it isn't. And one of those ways is not being arrogant and thinking you know best. And that's the issue I have with David Seymour, is he often comes across with this obtuse, liberal, Pollyannish almost view of how everything should be, that fails when reality smacks it in the face with a brick, right? And we need to find a happy medium in between those. And of course, you've got the Maori Party, which are implacable. I mean, the Maori Party today is not the Maori Party of Tariana Turia and Peter Sharples. It is an activist party that has quite bizarre changes to the views of actual history. We're originally, there was the treaty. We know what the treaty says, right? We were told for many, many decades that the treaty was a fraud, right? And we was robbed. You can't have the treaty was a fraud and we was robbed and we never ceded sovereignty. Because if you never ceded sovereignty, then the treaty's not a fraud, is it? But those are the two extremes of the activist arguments that have morphed, because treaty was a fraud brought us to Doug Graham saying to the National Party, we need to have a treaty settlement process, and starting a treaty settlement process because Maori think that the treaty's a fraud and they've been ripped off. In a lot of cases, Maori were ripped off. You just have to look at the map of the Waikato and have a look at roads that go dead straight and then all of a sudden start going all sorts of different directions. The only difference is where it was going in all sorts of different directions was that was Maori land, and you could build a road without compensating Maori owners. And where it's straight was European land originally, and they had to compensate the owners, so they went across that as quickly as they could. And you can see it on the map. It's as clear as day.
Yeah.
So there were cases of terrible things that were done to Maori to dispossess them of land and income and everything else, and it needs to be a redress. And I think most New Zealanders agree with that. But this heroic assumption that Queen Victoria, the Empress of India, the head of the largest empire the world's ever seen, signed a treaty on an equal partnership with a group of disparate chieftains. Now we're all equal. Because if you have the treaty is sovereign, that sovereignty wasn't ceded, then every iwi and every hapu is their own government. Well, that's not going to work.
They were back in that time. I mean, Māori were signing from a position of strength at that time, So I think the signing of the treaty between those two parties, to me, what it was, Māori were wanting the British to take care of their unruly people, and they wanted rangatiratanga over their own affairs, which was the way society was then, because they were the majority and there were only a few Europeans in the country at the time. But I think coming back to where we are today is that we're in this settler colonial model, which is about establishing, rangatiratanga in the sense of, I think they're wanting a Māori party, or they're wanting to overturn this. I'm not sure exactly what they're wanting, but there's been a shift in what the position of the Māori party is. But I think aside from the Māori party, you've got the whole of Māoridom who have felt threatened by what Seymour has done, what this government is doing. And that's something that's more kind of beyond the Māori party. It's something that strikes to the core of Māoridom. It's this feeling that our language is under threat, the treaty is under threat, which for the vast majority of Māoridom is important. Many Māori see that treaty as a sacred covenant. And so I think the Māori party were very strategically clever in their Toitu Te Tiriti campaign, which was a very basic message of honour the treaty, even though I don't think, if you look at the facts, I don't think the treaty was actually under threat, but that's their perception that it was under threat. When you look at that whole body of Māoridom that came out on those marches and the massive amount of submissions that were made, you're looking into the heart of Māoridom there. For Māori, this is important and they feel this is under attack. And so, coming back to what you're saying about David Seymour, you can have these rational arguments. It is different with Māori, with the Māori community as a whole. It's identity, it's connected to identity, it's connected to the heart of the people. And so that's kind of a cultural clash.
But is that real though? This like everyone talks about the large number of submissions. I've seen plenty of bills over the years where there's been a large number of submissions against the bill and the government's put it through anyway. Right? The firearms one is a classic example. 98% of submissions were against the government's proposal for a gun register and everything like that. But it was ignored. But somehow now we've got this narrative that if there's a lot of submissions that are against a bill, that it shouldn't pass. In which case now we've got a situation of mob rule, if that's the case, where if you can muster people to come and march on Parliament, that your argument...
Is that mob rule or is that democracy?
Well, no, it's not, because we had tens of thousands of people march on Parliament to oppose Jacinda Ardern's regime.
True.
With the COVID stuff, and they were ignored. In fact, it was worse than they were ignored. They had the police set upon them, and they were beaten senseless. And now we're seeing the court cases that are coming out for the excesses that occurred with the police and the government. And there's Ardern swanning around the world going on about peace, love, and mung beans, when it was the exact opposite of that. So it is kind of mob rule, except when it suits.
I don't think it's mob rule, though. I mean, I don't think the problem is that the people marched on Parliament. That's what a democracy...
The problem is the politicians choose who they're going to ignore and or not ignore.
Yeah, but, with this whole treaty principles bill, National Party from the outset said they didn't support it. So, again, that's part of the parliamentary...
And I think that was a have.
Well, it was a part of the coalition deal.
Yeah, I know, but I think Luxon showed cowardice, right? He should have said, let's have the debate. That's why we have bills. That's why we have people who support it. That's, okay, we've got a bill here. This is what's been proposed. Now let's suggest some amendments. But Luxon said, no, we won't have the debate. We'll support it to the first reading and then not after that. Well, everything that's important in a bill that goes through everything in Parliament happens at the second reading. And all of the select committee processes and everything which molds and changes the bill so it doesn't look like what is originally submitted. And I think that Luxon showed abject cowardice. Winston's position was slightly different. He said we shouldn't have this bill because who says that these are the principles? And what's to stop a future government in 20 years' time, now that we've got a Treaty Principles Act, saying, well, we don't agree that these principles that are in this act are any good, so we're going to amend them. And we've seen this multiple times where laws have been brought in with one intended purpose, and then we've had a plethora of unintended consequences as a result. And his position was pure, there are no principles in the treaty. There's 3 articles, there are no principles. And the principles argument, the whole principles argument comes back to an activist judiciary that through one judgment brought into being this idea of principles, and then various courts and bills of parliament have come in talking about principles of the Treaty of Waitangi without actually knowing them. But no one is brave enough to say, let's have the debate. And that's the bit that astonishes me, that the National Party basically sold out the rest of the country for to avoid having a robust debate.
I think I think it's just been handled very badly. Māori have their processes for having debates. It happens all the time. They have hui up and down the country and they discuss these things. I don't think Pākehā society has the same sort of model of how to have a debate.
No, we used to, but that doesn't happen.
And then how do we have the cross-cultural debate? The way it's been handled has been
but it's like the debate over tikanga, right? Winston says, well, tikanga is dependent on it can be tikanga at the marae, and that's different from the tikanga at that marae, which is different from the tikanga at that marae. So how do you have this homogenized view of tikanga? Who's determining that? Is there a discussion amongst all Maori? Is Ngāpuhi's view different from Tainui's view, which is different from Tūwharetoa's view? How do you have this homogenized view, and yet we're being told that this is the view? Yet here we are talking with different points of view. You're Maori. We've got Maori like Tina Ngata, who oppose absolutely everything that you say. We've got Winston Peters, who's Maori, who disagrees with what David Seymour says, who's Maori. Right? So this is the thing that I struggle with. I haven't got a dog in this fight. Right? I was born in Fiji. I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm sitting here watching, going, "What's going on? Why can't we just all be Kiwis?" Isn't that
What does that mean?
Isn't that
What does that mean?
Well, because that's been changed too, right? But
There's no homogenized group of any people, right?
So we're
There's always diversity.
And where did we start this conversation? We were talking about how we can't have conversations because we're talking past each other, and it's going to require people to be brave.
That's what we, it's diversity. We're one country, but we've got to allow room for that diversity, and we don't want to be in a homogenized, vanilla kind of a
No, you end up like
country.
Japan.
Yeah, so
Right.
diversity is good, and finding a way to respect the diversity of different people groups, but to have a harmonious whole, social cohesion, I suppose is the popular word for that. That's the challenge.
So it is the challenge, but it gets worse because the socialists want social cohesion through coercion,
Right.
right? And liberals want social cohesion through debate.
Uh-huh.
Classical liberals, not,
So
Democrats.
I guess this is the political process, right?
Yeah. Or instead of, this is the thing. This is why I've got this podcast, right?
Yeah.
Because we had a group of people who wanted to silence me. They wrote books about me to silence me. It was all designed to silence me. And I'm saying, well, why don't you debate me, right? Instead of banning me or blocking me and shunning and all of those things that don't encourage debate. And so that's why this is getting, I don't call them interviews, it's conversations. These conversations are getting thousands of views, tens of thousands of views, because people are wanting these conversations to occur. We're never going to agree 100% on everything. Your politics might be completely different from mine, but I don't care. I just want to have a chat.
Yeah.
But let's just get, I guess, a final one to wind this up. Let's talk about Tina Ngata, right? She says, make no mistake, there is no Indigenous support for Israel.
Yeah.
Well, you're Maori.
Yeah.
And you support Israel. That's not no Indigenous support.
Yeah. So when I first read Tina's article, I dismissed it because, it had so much outrageous stuff in there. Like, I'm connected to the far right, apparently, because I have a friend.
Well, you will, yeah, because you're on my podcast.
Yeah. So possibly.
So we share the same religion. We're both Christians. So.
Yeah. And that's probably enough to be called far right. I don't know. But I dismissed it. But then I heard that she is being quoted in different contexts, including on a university where I was doxed. My name and phone number, address was put up in this seminar or workshop, whatever it is. So I decided I really need to speak back to this, which is why I looked into it a bit more closely. So what she effectively does is just dismisses Māori who don't buy into her narrative, which is this post-colonial narrative, and it's the idea that true Indigenous people do this, they believe this, and they follow these various tenets. It's very much, in my mind, like a religion. You have a dogma that you're supposed to embrace, and for those who are of Māori heritage, who don't hold to those dogmas, they're not Māori. So that's how she can say there is no Māori support. She dismisses all of us Māori who do support because we don't fit into her categories. But the truth is, there are a lot of Māori who support Israel, and over the years, there have been a lot of Māori who have supported Israel. I mean, the Māori Queen, Dame Te Atarangi Kahu, wouldn't have a Jewish person coming onto her marae to talk about Israel and on the anniversary of Israel's establishment if she didn't support Israel. And so there've been many examples of Māori who support Israel, and even recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to speak on a marae about Israel. There were maybe 125 people there. The feedback I got was very warm. I had a lot of people coming up thanking me for what I said. The organizer has said he wants to organize more of these. So there's definitely support
So
for
she's not right.
Israel.
She's not right.
She's not correct. But she has an ideology, a political ideology that twists the facts and the information and the history. And, this is the settler colonial ideology that she embraces, which sees Christianity as colonial, which criticizes science for being colonial, that attacks all of these different parts of our society today as being colonial. So I object to the use of that labeling of all these things as colonial. It's part of this idea that colonialism is an ongoing structure that has to be dismantled and interrogated because of power relationships, and it creates this binary of the oppressor and the oppressed. I just reject that whole system and way of seeing the world. I think it's a destructive way of seeing the world. I think it's harmful. It's inaccurate. It ignores historical facts. You really have to twist information to make it fit the model.
And yet they have a voice in the media.
They do.
They have a voice that is promoted by the media. And it takes podcasts and individuals and people who are alternate to the mainstream media. We get mocked. I've been mocked for 20 years, yet I'm still here and I'm still effective at what I do. And, I'm number one for a reason. It doesn't make me go away because I don't want to play that way. I like playing my way. And I've found that having these conversations, and openly discussing these things and not shying away from those difficult conversations is how we have to break the mold of this combative, polarized world that the media are still locked into, even though their audience is disappearing on them at a great rate of knots. My audience isn't disappearing, it's growing. Their audience is disappearing and not growing. So I think I've got the model right. I'm not sure they've got the model right. And when they adapt, it'll be too late. But that's why we need to have these conversations, what I call courageous conversations. We're not afraid to raise these topics or to disagree. It's okay to disagree with somebody. Let's talk about the ideas and the points of disagreement. We might find those disagreement points are very tiny. And actually, we're on board with 80 or 90%, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's all right.
For sure.
Oh, Sheree, thank you so much for coming on the Good Oil podcast. It's been a real pleasure. And I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks
for having me.